Each group will be given a MSR Whisperlite stove to utilize for cooking. Here, again, this is the MSR. Every group will have the same bag, and when we unbox the bag, as you'll see here, or open up the bag, it comes with a few things. Every bag will have a lighter. Every bag will have a set of pliers that are useful for grabbing hot things. This is the fuel pump, and we'll go through that. That's going to go into the fuel canister that we have here. Finally, you have the actual stove, and a few things to note on the stove is you have a fuel line here. It's that tiny tip right there, and that's encased in a covering. All right, so we want that to be clean as much as possible. And then finally, we also have a bag that is going to be actually quite important because it is going to hold our reflector plate and our windshield. And that's just basically to help us conserve fuel by keeping the heat in. And it comes with two pieces. You have the bottom reflector plate, which will open up like such and give you a perfect circle. And then you will have your windscreen. The windscreen is also important because it does protect the flame from wind. Now, I recommend getting this set up before you actually start the stove so that it's all ready. And the way that you use the windscreen, it might already be pre-folded, but essentially you will take the two ends, overlap them like so, and then you'll just sort of pinch them and then roll them a few times over each other. Okay, it doesn't have to be fancy, but that's the best way. And you basically just want it to be just big enough for the pot to actually sit right in there. And we'll do a demonstration with that in a moment. We'll actually head outside. You've got your actual stove. And the stove has these sort of three legs that go around it. And to activate those, you simply squeeze them from top and bottom, and that'll let you slide them around the whole distance. And as you can see, there are a few little divots in the metal edging of the stove where you want these legs to actually go. Okay, every group will get a fuel bottle. It'll be filled up. In order to open these, you actually need to push down with quite a bit of force and unscrew. And sometimes, depending on the temperature, it might actually hiss a little bit, which is because it's been pressurized. So to set this up, you will take your fuel pump that I have here, and you will get the fuel stem and the remainder of the pump into the fuel canister. Now, when you're filling up the fuel canister, there is actually a line on the outside here that says how full you need to fill it. And that's going to be hard to gauge exactly, but you sort of eyeball it and get it as close as possible. Okay, you don't want to fill it up all the way because when you pressurize it, you can overflow. So in order to get this inside, you simply put in the white part first, the stem, and then the remainder of the filter, and then you simply make sure that it's threaded properly to screw it on. It doesn't have to be on super tight, really just about a finger's full or a finger turn, and it's gonna be nice and snug. Usually I will actually attach the whole system at this point in time, and what you'll see is on the stove, you actually have a little clasp here, and on the fuel canister you have a port. The fuel line is going to actually get inserted into that port like so, and then you will take that clasp, flip it over the top, and you'll lock it in. And so when this is all said and done, you've got a nice little system here where you can see you've got the fuel canister with the fuel pump, you've got the clasp on it, the fuel line running to the stove, and the stove's legs are opened up to the 3 sides. And the windscreen actually has a cut out portion here that simply goes down over the fuel line. And voila. There are essentially 2 ways, or I sort of alluded to 2 ways of setting up the fuel canister and the stove. The actual instructions tell you to pump it first and then attach everything. I tend to attach it first and then pump it. That's usually because I'll actually leave this all intact overnight if the weather's not going to be bad. But you can pump it first and then attach it, or attach it and then pump it. It's really going to be your choice. But if you want, so generally you'll pump it about 20 or 30 times, and so it's pretty obvious. You just pull up. Okay. And then once you've got it pumped, that's when you'll actually take the fuel line and insert it into the port and close the latch. And now comes the tricky part. So in the fuel stove, right down here, you see this small cup. And that cup is going to be really, really important, because what it does, and I'm going to zoom it in there, that small little saucer right there at the bottom of the stove, when you actually open up the valve on the fuel canister, you're going to begin to let liquid fuel fill up that cup. And so when you open up the fuel valve, you want to do it just until you start to hear a little bit of liquid coming in to that cup. And you'll have to pay attention. It might be hard to see here. But once you have the cup about half full, you'll immediately shut off the valve. Okay? And I'm also going to show you, it might be hard to see, but inside that little hole, there's a little bit of a pyramid type structure, and that is actually where the fuel comes out of. Okay? So we've pumped up our canister. We're now going to open the valve, and we're going to watch for fuel to fill up the cup. And it may take a few moments, but you'll start to see a jet or a stream of fuel coming out of that pyramid in the hole that I showed you. And you'll start to see fuel filling up the cup, and you might be able to see a little bit of the reflection there right in that cup. Now the next part is where it actually gets quite tricky. We now have to light that on fire, and the reason you're doing that is because you actually need to heat up the whole system so that when the fuel that is coming out of the fuel line gets to the stove itself is hot enough to essentially turn it into gas immediately, and then treat it as a normal gas stove. So we're going to light, and this can be a little scary at first, but you're gonna get your lighter, and you're gonna see a bright yellow flame at first, okay? You can always cover it with your windscreen if you're worried about it blowing out. Open up our valve again, and we will light the stove up top. And you might not be able to see it because it's a nice clear blue flame, but you can probably hear it. And that's essentially how you get your stove started. If the flame starts to become more yellow, you pump it up. If it goes too low, you may need to increase the opening of the valve. But essentially this is either on or off. That's the way these stoves are. It's either on or it's off. There's no adjusting it like a kitchen stove. At this point in time, you would then put your windscreen on, and you could put your pots on top and begin cooking. When you're all done, pretty easy to do. You just close the valve. All right. So we've moved back inside to finish up the discussion on stoves, and I wanted to take a moment and talk about the pot system that we're going to use in the field. And basically, once again, this is an MSR pot set. Pretty simple to use, very versatile. First thing you'll notice is the way it's closed. You turn the top knob so it lies parallel to the handle here. Open it up. And the large pot comes with a handle, and in order to close the handle, if you want to set the system back up, is you'll simply put the lid on, you'll push that red button, fold the handle up, turn it, and you're ready to go. Generally what we do is we'll actually put the stove, once it's in its bag, back inside this pot in order to keep everything compact and together. There are a couple ways to store the stove. The first way is going to be under the assumption that you're going to be using it later that day, or you plan to leave it out overnight, knowing that the weather does not call for rain and there's no chance of it potentially being blown away if you're in a really windy campsite. And the way that you would do this is you would need to fold up your reflector plate and your windscreen, and you would put those back in the mesh bag that they came in and set them aside. But you would utilize your pot as a cover for the whole system. So you can take the top of the pot lid, and then take the pot and simply invert it. Now when you're ready to take apart and store the stove completely, in situations where the weather looks real bad or you're going to be hiking, the steps start similar to storing it overnight, in that you'll need to fold up the windscreen and the reflector plate and get those stored away. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to, from the fuel pump, you're going to unlatch the clasp, and then you're simply going to pull the fuel line out of the port. The next thing you're going to do is undo the fuel pump. Again, if it's still a little bit pressurized, you might have a little hiss or even leak a small amount of fuel. And you'll need to get your cap. And you'll take the actual pump out of the canister. Your fuel pump will then go back into your bag. Your canister you will close up and set aside. Your stove, you'll need to close the legs just by pinching and moving down like we talked about earlier. And then all of that will go back inside the bag. And if it's packed properly, the nice thing about this is that into the pot. And then you have your pot and your stove, your fuel canister, and you're ready to hit the trail. So one thing that we need to talk about is how to actually troubleshoot the stove if it doesn't seem to be working properly. Earlier we had talked about making sure that there's fuel in the bottle, making sure that it's pumped appropriately and pressurized, and then finally adjusting the valve for flow. Another simple thing that can be done to improve the efficiency of the stove, but also if it's not working, is inside that small hole in the stove where the fuel jet is, there's actually a small needle, almost is how I would describe it. And what that does is it will help clean out any carbon that's built up at the fuel jet. So if you notice that it's not staying lit or it's not creating a blue flame and you've troubleshooted the fuel and the pump system, then the final thing that you can do very simply is simply take the whole stove, and you might be able to hear it, but you'll just shake it. And what that's doing is that small needle or that small piece of metal that's built into the system is removing some of the carbon that's built up.